Something that seems to be in vogue today is the notion of positive freedom. Positive freedom is the idea that if you seize the product of the labor of someone else, that person will have less stuff. But by giving it to someone else, the person you give it to now has more freedom. For example, a mugger who steals $1,000 and now has $1,000 more money now has the freedom to spend that money which he didn't have before. Whether this follows from the definition of freedom, I'm not sure. But to the viewer, can you flap your arms and fly? No. Well, if you can, just pretend that you can't for now. But do you have the freedom to flap your arms and fly? Well, what does freedom mean? Certainly nobody is pointing a gun at your head and stopping you from flapping and flying. And for now, there are no regulations. Or for now, there's no you have the freedom to do so. Maybe if everyone started doing it, it would start getting regulated, and then you would have people pointing a gun at you. But for now, there's nobody pointing a gun at you, stopping you from flapping your arms and flying. You just lack the physical ability to do so. Similarly, nobody was stopping the mugger from spending $1,000 on stuff. He just didn't have the $1,000 to spend. When someone talks about positive freedom or positive liberty, as I'm using synonymously, what they're saying is that someone else must be coerced by another person in order to satisfy the desires of others. When you take resources from Bob and give them to Bill, no new resources have been created. What's more is that there is some transaction cost, so we can say there is less freedom to go around. But does this not sound absurd? Let's call them the Freedom Equivocators, who are also the Coercion Equivocators. The Freedom Equivocators will respond to this coercion charge by saying that there are such things as economic coercion and social coercion, or some go so far as to say that the physical environment is coercive. That is, if the lion doesn't eat, he dies, and that is nature's coercion, at which point the definition of coercion is so inflated that it is meaningless. But of course, that's the point of some freedom equivocators to bring up nature, that the term coercion is irrelevant because all is coercion. Now, what is economic coercion is vague, but that doesn't stop anti-statists from arguing that monopolies would be less than they are today on a free market, and that there would be less banking chicanery going on, and fractional reserve banking would be systematically disincentivized and unable to inflate at nearly the rate that it is today. I mean, there would be some, and there was some, but it's not, because it's not a law, the fractional reserve banks wouldn't be able to do what they do today. And employers can't just pay you whatever they want. In fact, arguments for the free market can be described as nothing more than a long defense against charges of economic coercion. Now, what is social coercion is even more vague, and this vagueness makes it impossible to argue against because any norm can be defined as social coercion. In a nutshell, the Freedom Equivocators say freedom equals free stuff. That is a very simple way to translate any sentence by a Freedom Equivocator. Just replace freedom with free stuff and you'll know what they mean. And they will have a convoluted explanation as to why freedom equals free stuff, but what this does is it muddies the waters with any conversation with the sane person, as is their intention. A clear way to define their position is that they oppose freedom because if left to their own devices, people would do bad things, and so we need people to control other people for their own good. And that includes seizing the product of labor and giving it to others. Now, this is a position I definitely don't agree with, but I can understand the reasoning if the people controlling the others are somehow more intelligent, like it's an intelligent oligarchy, and that can at least be internally consistent. But statists today aren't that. They're mostly pro-democracy, which is that people, if left to their own devices, would do bad things, and so they need to be controlled by people that the people being controlled choose. So it's not even internally consistent. And instead of heavy decentralization, where the forms of statism that work relatively compared to each other can reveal themselves, democracy snaps the majority opinion to an absolute. Now, some majoritarianism is just a fact of reality, as firms will cater to majority preferences, and some will cater to minority preferences as well. But what sets democracy apart is its absolute nature. And so democracy can more appropriately be called mob absolutism. Now, what I'm talking about does not emotionally resonate with some freedom equivocators. Some freedom equivocators have an emotional opposition to hierarchy and authority, and this comes from an inability to distinguish authority that denies emergence and authority that caters to emergence. Let me preempt the dumbass here. The state is emergent like cancer is emergent and like creationists evolve. The state, however, denies the emergent order and it imposes law from the top down, even though the state itself came from the bottom up. Okay. And so the position of these, we'll call them, these anti-boss equivocators is even more absurd, emotional, and because it's emotional, it's thus moralizing. We will call these people the super freedom equivocators. And the super freedom equivocators say, freedom equals freedom from consequence. People like this are Buddha Gem, the Left Libertarian, Brain Police 2, and Mr. 1001 Nights. Not only do they say freedom equals free stuff, and that they have a valid claim to the product of your labor, but that it is immoral for anyone to have to work beneath someone else. That's wage slavery, you see. Work for a boss or starve. And it is economic coercion. Now, they don't like to use the word employer very often, as that makes it too obvious. They prefer to use vague and transcendent words like authority and hierarchy. And so, whenever they say authority or hierarchy, just know that they mean employer. And economic coercion is them not being paid a wage that they want. A neat little linguistic trick they do is say, employer not paying me what I feel my labor is worth equals hierarchical and or authoritarian economic coercion. So don't be fooled by the freedom equivocators. There's a reason Paul Samuelson and many other major Keynesian economists praise the Soviet Union and why traditional anarchism is closely connected to communism, because it has nothing to do with freedom.